Well, here we go again, or do we? A growing sense over the weekend with the PM's backflip on those COVID cash payments that panic is again seeping back into how we're dealing with this pandemic. Today, leading epidemiologists are lobbying the government for a reset, which is more than likely code for more mandatory masks and more restrictions. And adding to the sense of crisis, the Victorian Premier out today, wanting the Prime Minister to give him military support for nursing homes in that state.
National Cabinet on Saturday didn't so much have a conversation about ADF in relation to ambulance, but we did have a conversation in relation to ADF support and the surge teams that are in private sector aged care.
Right, to get across this and more, joining me now is the National Editor of The Australian, Dennis Shanahan. Welcome, Dennis. This isn't living with COVID. I mean, given the debt and all the worry, and I think justifiably there from the Treasurer today about a deteriorating fiscal position, why the backflip from the PM on Saturday morning?
Well, I think simple politics, Peter. What we've seen is that in the last 48 hours, the last 72 hours, the Treasurer has spelt out without any doubt that the pandemic payment could not be extended because it was going to add to the debt, the $1 trillion in debt, which was the legacy of the Morrison government and the pandemic spending. Jim Chalmers was absolutely straight about this. Previously, Anthony Albanese had said the same thing, that there was just no way that you could just pull this back and change the direction. Now, of course, this was in conflict to what Labor said in opposition when they wanted to extend and expand pandemic payments. They were in favour of more spending. Then they sought to blame the government for the end of the former government for the end of the pandemic payment by saying, oh, this is a legacy issue, this is the heritage issue, this is the decision by the coalition, by Scott Morrison. Well, what happened? There was pressure. And as soon as the pressure came on, the Prime Minister backed off and agreed to spend hundreds of millions of dollars more. The Treasurer was left out trying to say, yes, we're going to make savings in the budget, and yet there they were, at the first sign of pressure, reverting to the pandemic excuse. The pandemic, part of it, they criticised the Morrison government for, and that was simply just taking health advice and not making political and economic decisions. Well, the Prime Minister has blamed the former government for the situation, and now he is taking and using health advice as the excuse to have a huge backflip, which his own Treasurer said wasn't sustainable. So what we've seen, pressure, politics, and we're going, what is Prime Minister Anthony Albanese going to do in September when the petrol excise comes off and it goes up? His argument is, oh, that was another decision by the previous government. We inherited that deadline. Well, that was a tough decision that Scott Morrison and Josh Frydenberg took. They put a limit on it. Well, is Anthony Albanese under pressure again in September from the union movement, from the premiers, from consumer groups, going to just say, no, we'll extend the cut to petrol excise? These decisions build pressure on the leadership, and this decision on Saturday has all the hallmarks of a touch of trying to make good on quick politics at the cost of long-term economic management.
And a fair amount of panic. I felt that the pressure ramping up at the end of last week from the Premiers caused the PM to not just move on this decision, which he'd repeatedly ruled out, but also to bring forward that National Cabinet meeting, make sure he got it into the Sunday papers, that big splash. We saw in New Zealand today, they have moved to extend that petrol tax holiday right into next year. There'll be pressure, as you say, come September for Labor to do the same thing here. Let's stay on economic issues, because we've just had that 5% or over 5% wage case get up in the Fair Work Commission. You've now, and let's not forget, employers are paying that hike in superannuation as well. News today, the Australian Workers Union, Manufacturing Workers Union, they want to see a new 8% pay hike. And they're saying, well, we'll give you strikes if we don't get what we want. Now, you and I both know manufacturing is being hit hard by these energy prices skyrocketing, Dennis. So where are the profits for these big manufacturers to pay an 8% hike in wages?
Well, this is the problem, of course, of once the minimum wage, and everyone said, OK, fair enough, those who need the money most need to get a bit of an increase, and they did, and that was agreed to. But the difficulty here is once the unions start to line up, the more muscular unions start to line up, you then run into a stage where they start to feed into inflation, they seek higher and higher wage rises, and they expect the government to support them. Now, Anthony Albanese, while he said he was an advisor, an economic advisor to the Whitlam government, has stated he wants to rule more like Bob Hawke and Paul Keating. Well, he's going to have a summit, a wages summit. People are going to come and talk about it. But what he has to remember is that the accord of the Hawke-Keating years and of the ACTU leadership with people like Kelty, these people actually cut wages growth, they increased productivity, and they made some very tough decisions. Just having unions come out piecemeal, making these agreements, appeals, the Prime Minister has to ensure that he can keep these under control, and it's going to be even harder than trying to keep the cut down on the pandemic payments.
Right, Parliament's back next week. The PM said first order of business will be to legislate his 43% emissions reduction target. Now, the Libs opposed this at the election, but they've now got backbenchers. We've talked about Bridget Archer last week, but today, New South Wales Senator Andrew Bragg, he wants to be king of the moderates. He's also threatening to cross the floor and vote with Labor. The Greens say now they'll negotiate with the government, but they also want a ban on new coal and gas projects as well as higher targets. It's going to be pretty interesting not just for the government, but for Peter Dutton to keep all his frogs in the wheelbarrow.
Well, indeed. Look, Peter Dutton has a mandate, just as Anthony Albanese has a mandate. Peter Dutton is the leader of the opposition based on the fact that they had a policy which did not go as far as 43%. Labor has a mandate for 43%. The Greens claim a mandate and the Teals for more. So the pressure on Anthony Albanese is coming from the opposition, saying they don't want it to go as high as 43 and allow the legislation, and from the other side, where they say they actually want more. And not just more, but to actually stop new coal and gas projects. Now, this is completely unacceptable for Labor. Labor cannot do this. They can talk about their targets, but they cannot turn their back on the workers in regional Australia. They actually they strengthened their position in the Hunter, but turning their backs on new coal and gas projects in Northern Territory, in Queensland, New South Wales, elsewhere, they just cannot afford to do this. And so Anthony Albanese would actually like, I think, to get a few of those Liberal frogs over on his side, and then he can continue his opposition to the Greens' more radical agenda, and at the same time deny Peter Dutton a political victory on the legislative side. So it may well be that once again, Liberal rats on climate change will change the agenda again for the coalition.
And it's not wrong that they're coloured green, because that's where I think Bragg and Archer absolutely are on some of this policy. Dennis, thank you as always.